Long before the first European charts marked the coastline of Florida, and decades before a strange expedition dug into the mud of a small barrier island, the people of the Gulf Coast were already building roads of their own. Not roads of stone, not roads of packed earth, roads made of shell, according to the traditions passed down among the descendants of the region's earliest inhabitants. These were never simply piles of discarded oyster and whelk shells left behind after generations of meals. They were raised, engineered causeways, built shell by shell over centuries, wide enough to walk in procession, elevated above the tidal marsh and connecting villages, temple mounds, and sacred watercourts across a coastline that would not appear correctly on a European map for another 300 years. Then, in the winter of 1896, an expedition financed by two of the wealthiest women in America arrived on a small island off the coast of southwest Florida and began digging into the black, waterlogged muck. What the excavators found in the weeks that followed would astonish the archaeological world. And then, almost as quickly as it was uncovered, much of it began to disappear in front of their eyes. More than a century later, one question still lingers along that coastline. Were these shell formations simply the natural residue of centuries of coastal life, as generations of surveyors and road crews assumed? Or had 19th and 20th century settlers unknowingly quarried straight through and paved directly over one of the largest engineered transportation networks built in North America before Columbus ever reached the Caribbean? Today, we're examining the expedition records, the oral traditions, and the buried infrastructure of a coastline that may have been far more connected and far more deliberately engineered than history has ever given it credit for. To understand why the shell roads of the Gulf Coast still raise questions today, we have to go back long before any surveyor walked that shoreline with a compass and a notebook. Long before railroads, before the first Spanish ships appeared on the horizon, the people who lived along the barrier islands and river mouths of what is now Florida had already built an extraordinary relationship with the water around them. These were not wandering, temporary settlements. Archaeologists now recognize that some of these coastal communities were large, permanent, and remarkably organized, supported almost entirely by the abundance of the estuary rather than by farming. And to move between their villages, their fishing grounds, and their ceremonial centers, they built something that most outsiders, for a very long time, simply failed to notice. They built roads out of the one material they had in near-limitless supply shell. Oral traditions carried forward by descendant communities along the Gulf Coast describe these as raised walking paths, built up over generations until they stood higher than the surrounding marsh, allowing people to move between settlements without wading through tidal mud. Some accounts describe them stretching in straight, deliberate lines for great distances, cutting directly across islands rather than following the natural curve of the shoreline. Others describe wide platforms of shell built beside canals, allowing goods to be moved by both water and land at once, depending on the season and the tide. To many of the elders who preserved these accounts, this was never simply a curiosity of the landscape. It was part of their history and their identity, a memory of ancestors who reshaped the coastline itself to serve the needs of a thriving, deeply organized people, long before anyone arrived to write any of it down. Before we continue, if you enjoy documentaries that explore forgotten history through expedition records, archaeology, and indigenous tradition, consider subscribing. It helps the channel and allows me to keep researching stories like this one, because what happened in the winter of 1896 would bring outside attention to this coastline for the first time, and it would do so in a way nobody expected. In December of that year, an expedition funded through the Pepperhurst philanthropic sponsorship and led by an ethnologist named Frank Hamilton Cushing arrived at a small island near the mouth of a river on Florida's southwest coast. Cushing had spent years living among indigenous communities in the American Southwest, and he had developed a reputation for taking seriously the kinds of oral traditions that many of his contemporaries dismissed outright. What drew his attention to this particular island was a report from local residents describing strange, waterlogged muck that occasionally surfaced with fragments of carved wood, cordage, and tools unlike anything typically preserved in Florida's sandy, acidic soil. Cushing's team began digging into what turned out to be an ancient, sealed pond of black muck, cut off from oxygen for hundreds of years. And almost immediately, The excavation produced something remarkable. Because the muck had kept air away from the buried material for centuries, it had preserved objects that should never have survived in a Florida climate. Carved wooden masks, finely worked bowls, netting, cordage, and woodwork bearing painted designs still visible after hundreds of years underground. Among the most striking discoveries was a small wooden carving of a feline figure so finely made that it would later be regarded as one of the most important works of pre-Columbian art ever recovered in North America. But it wasn't only the carvings that caught the expedition's attention. Surrounding the settlement, Cushing documented something else entirely: engineered watercourts, canals, and raised embankments, built almost entirely of shell, forming what looked less like a random midden and more like the deliberate infrastructure of an organized community. Some of these raised shell formations extended in straight lines across the island, connecting the residential mounds to canals that led out toward open water. To Cushing, the site did not look like the accidental byproduct of centuries of discarded shells. It looked like a built environment, a settlement with roads. Then something happened that would echo for more than a century. The wooden artifacts, having survived hundreds of years underwater, began to deteriorate rapidly once exposed to open air. Despite efforts to preserve them, many of the most delicate carvings crumbled, warped, or disintegrated within weeks of being removed from the muck that had protected them. Photographs were taken, sketches were made, and detailed notes were recorded, but a significant portion of what Cushing's team uncovered simply did not survive long enough to be studied, the way later generations of archaeologists would have wanted. The expedition's full written reports were also slower to circulate than expected, delayed for years by publication issues, and by the time a more complete account finally appeared, the broader academic community had moved on to other questions. The site itself, along with the surrounding shell formations connecting it to other islands nearby, received only a fraction of the sustained investigation that a discovery of this scale might otherwise have demanded. As decades passed, researchers returning to the region began asking an increasingly uncomfortable question. If this coastline had truly been shaped by an engineered network of shell roads and canals, where had it gone? The answer, when it came, was not a conspiracy. It was something far more ordinary, and in its own way, far more troubling. Beginning in the late 1800s and continuing well into the 20th century, road-building crews across Florida needed a cheap, readily available paving material for the state's rapidly expanding network of rural roads. Crushed shell, it turned out, was perfect for the job. And the largest, most convenient deposits of shell along the coast were not natural beaches. They were the ancient shell mounds and shell causeways left behind by the very communities Cushing had been studying. Historical road department records confirm that shell was mined directly from ancient mounds and ridges up and down the Gulf Coast to surface new automobile roads, with little to no archaeological survey conducted beforehand. Entire mounds, some of which may have marked the endpoints of engineered shell causeways, were leveled by dredges and dump trucks and spread across the landscape as gravel. In some documented cases, crews mining these deposits later reported finding human remains, tools, and pottery mixed in with the shell. They were removing material that was, by that point, already being crushed beneath a new generation of roads. In other words, the very transportation network being investigated may have been destroyed in part to build the transportation network that replaced it. That single detail transforms the mystery. This is not simply a question of whether ancient shell roads existed. It is a question of how much of that evidence has already been quarried away, decades before anyone thought to ask what it represented. And that uncertainty becomes even more striking when placed beside the oral traditions that descendant communities had preserved all along. According to those traditions, the ancestors who built these coastal settlements did not think of shell the way later visitors did, as debris to be cleared away. Shell was treated as a building material in its own right, deliberately selected, layered, and packed to create solid, elevated ground in a landscape that offered very little of it naturally. Elders describe entire ceremonial centers raised several feet above the surrounding marsh, using nothing but generations of carefully placed shell, along with walking paths built the same way, connecting mounds that might otherwise have been isolated by tidal water for much of the year. Some accounts describe specific causeways used for seasonal gatherings, wide enough for processions, and maintained by each new generation as an ongoing responsibility rather than a one-time construction project. Others describe canals running parallel to these shell roads, allowing canoes to move goods alongside the people walking above them, an integrated system of water and land transportation built entirely without draft animals, wheels, or metal tools. To the descendant communities who preserved these accounts, this was never presented as legend or folklore in the way outsiders sometimes assumed. It was remembered as engineering, a practical, sophisticated response to living successfully along a coastline that offered abundant food but very little dry, stable ground. There are even accounts describing how the roads were built, passed down not as vague myth, but as something closer to instruction. Layers of whole shell were said to be packed first, providing drainage and structure, followed by crushed shell pressed down to form a harder, walkable surface above the waterline. Generation after generation, families were remembered as having contributed to the same causeway, adding new layers as older ones settled or eroded, until a single road might represent the accumulated labor of ancestors who had never met one another. Certain routes were said to be walked only during specific ceremonies, timed to the tides and the seasons, while others were used daily to move fish, tools, and materials between settlements. What stands out most, according to those who preserved this knowledge, is that the roads were never separated from the water around them. Unlike a highway built to avoid flooding, these causeways were designed to work with the tide, remaining just high enough to stay dry during normal conditions, while allowing canals beside them to rise and fall freely. It was, by every account, a transportation system built specifically for a landscape that most outsiders would later describe as nearly impossible to develop. None of this, by itself, proves that every shell ridge along the Gulf Coast was part of a deliberately built road. Some formations almost certainly are the natural result of centuries of shellfish harvesting, exactly as early surveyors assumed. But researchers using modern mapping technology have found reason to think the traditional explanation does not account for everything. In recent years, archaeologists working along this same stretch of coastline have used LiDAR, a laser-based aerial mapping technology, capable of revealing subtle variations in elevation hidden beneath dense vegetation, to re-examine sites first documented more than a century ago. The resulting maps have revealed straight, deliberate alignments running between mounds and canals, formations that would be difficult to explain as the random accumulation of discarded shells over time. Some of these alignments appear to connect settlements that are separated by open water or dense mangrove, suggesting a level of coordinated construction that surprised even researchers who had studied the region for years. At the same time, aerial and satellite surveys have identified additional shell works further inland and along nearby islands that were never documented by Cushing's expedition or by any of the road crews who quarried similar formations decades later. Some of these sites remain difficult to access, buried beneath dense mangrove or partially submerged by rising water levels, and have yet to be fully surveyed. Researchers comparing these newer surveys to 19th century land records have noticed something else worth mentioning. Several of the earliest county roads platted along this stretch of coast follow paths that curve in unusually specific ways, avoiding low ground and threading between wetlands almost as if the surveyors were, without realizing it, following an older route that had already solved the same problem centuries earlier. No single record confirms this outright, but the pattern has been noted often enough that some archaeologists now consider it worth further investigation, rather than dismissing it as coincidence. So, more than a century after the Pepperhurst expedition first excavated that muck-filled pond, the coastline still holds an unresolved question. Either the shell formations documented along Florida's Gulf Coast are almost entirely the accidental byproduct of centuries of coastal living, exactly as generations of engineers and surveyors assumed when they mined them for road material, or an intentionally engineered network of shell roads and canals once connected communities across this coastline in ways that were only partially recorded before much of the physical evidence was quarried away. And that uncertainty becomes harder to dismiss once you consider how much of the coastline has already been altered. Roads, causeways, bridges, and modern development now cover long stretches of shoreline where these ancient shell formations once stood. Some were leveled entirely, Others survive only as isolated mounds, disconnected from whatever network may once have linked them together. More than a century has passed since Cushing's team first opened that ancient muck pond, and in that time, the Gulf Coast has changed almost beyond recognition. Highways now run along routes that may once have followed ancient shell causeways. Bridges span channels that ancient canals may have once served the same purpose for entire neighborhoods sit atop ground that was raised, quite possibly, by the same engineering tradition Cushing first documented more than 100 years ago. Yet despite all of that development, the story has never completely disappeared. It resurfaces every time construction crews report unearthing shell deposits, mixed with pottery, or tools they cannot explain. It resurfaces every time a LiDAR survey reveals another perfectly straight alignment running beneath the mangrove. And it resurfaces whenever descendant communities are asked about the meaning of these formations and offer an answer entirely different from the one recorded in early road department reports. History has not settled the question, and it may never fully be able to. Instead, it has left behind a scattering of evidence. An expedition report interrupted by artifacts that crumbled before they could be fully studied, a state road system quietly built from the material of the very sites now being investigated, and an oral tradition that had already been describing engineered shell roads for generations before any outsider thought to ask. Some descendant communities have expressed hesitation about further excavation of these sites, viewing many of the surviving shell mounds and causeways as sacred ground, rather than simply an archaeological curiosity to be dug up and displayed. That perspective does not confirm every detail of the oral tradition, and it does not attempt to settle the historical debate on its own. But it asks for the same thing the Hopi have asked regarding the Grand Canyon, and the same thing descendant communities across this continent have asked again and again: respect for what remains, whether or not it can ever be fully proven. Perhaps one day more complete LiDAR surveys, underwater archaeology, or newly uncovered expedition notes will reveal exactly how far this shell road network once extended, and how much of it disappeared beneath the pavement of a state that never knew what it was quarrying. Or perhaps the fullest answer was never buried in the mud at all. Perhaps it was always carried in the memory of the people who built those roads, long before anyone thought to draw a map of this coastline, generations before the first surveyor's stake was ever driven into that shell-packed ground. What cannot be debated is that these traditions and the physical shell formations connected to them have survived for centuries, longer than the road departments that quarried them, longer than the state of Florida itself, and far longer than any single expedition sent to study them. Perhaps that is why this coastline continues to fascinate the people who study it. Not because every question has been answered, but because every new survey, every new storm that shifts the sand, and every new generation returns to the same shoreline and asks the same question. What, if anything, still lies buried beneath the roads we drive on today? Thank you for watching. If you enjoy documentaries that explore forgotten history through expedition records, archaeology, indigenous tradition, and original source material, consider subscribing for more investigations like this. And before you go, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you think the shell mounds mined for early Florida roads were simply ordinary midden debris, or could they have been the remains of a deliberately engineered road network that history quietly paved over? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you in the next documentary.